It right there. Hi, good afternoon. Um, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, so if I sniffle, please forgive me. Um, first of all, good afternoon. It's a beautiful day. And by the way, we have contacted facilities, so the meat locker feel should dissipate a little bit soon. And welcome to ladies and gentlemen, and especially a special welcome to the students. I'm Barbara Bodine, and I have the privilege and the pleasure of serving as the director of the school's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. It's in this role that I welcome you today to the 2024 Edward Teddy Weintal Lecture in honor of Edward Wong, the New York Times diplomatic correspondent at the Department of State and former Times bureau chief in Beijing. His remarks, Ground Truthing China, a journalist's perspective from Beijing and Washington, will draw on his reporting experience and his newly released memoir, At the Edge, A Family Reckoning with China. Edward is highly respected both within the journalism community and those in the policy and academic world who focus on China and foreign policy. The Weintal Prize in Diplomatic Journalism was established by Teddy Weintal as part of a very generous bequest to the university. Teddy was a Polish diplomat in Washington in the 1930s, excuse me, and after his diplomatic career was cut short by the Nazi occupation of his homeland, he started a new, highly successful career in journalism. In late 1944, Newsweek, when it was credible journalism, hired Teddy to cover diplomacy and eventually to work with the magazine's chief as the magazine's chief European correspondent, a position he held until 1969. After that, he became a special counselor to the director of the United States Information Agency, which is a precursor to the Department of State's Bureau of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. In establishing this prize, Teddy Weintal set out to recognize excellent news, magazine, and electronic reporting on foreign policy and diplomatic affairs, with a particular attention to original and courageous reporting. Over the decades, the award has been given to an astonishing array of journalism giants in all media, each of them a testament to the professionalism and courage of their field. A question that I was asked quite recently was, why is the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy giving an award for journalism? And on the surface, that may seem a bit odd. Diplomacy's role is to advance the U.S. national interests, security, prosperity, values, using a variety of national tools. It is essentially, although not solely, a state function. And one can see its importance to our new republic in that the Department of State was the first federal agency established. Journalism's core role is to shine a clear and bright light on events, actors, their actions, both domestic and foreign. They serve as the truth to power balance wheel, a role that does not always earn them the love and affection of those they report on. But in significant ways, we, and I still refer to diplomacy as we, and our journalism colleagues are drawn to and seek a similar thing: an understanding and appreciation of events around the world that affect all of us. Rather than a counterpunch to our work as diplomats, in many instances, journalists are a counterpart. Particularly overseas, their access may exceed ours. Their analysis may inform ours and even shift ours. Their ability to dig deep into an issue may exceed the bandwidth of an overstretched embassy and its staff. And to go back to first principles, they can and speak hard truth. At the same time, our journalism colleagues have an audience far beyond the narrow distribution of embassy cables. They inform the public that may not yet understand evolving global issues. And by informing, they shape opinion. and as they shape opinion, they affect policy. No policy, no diplomacy can or should be done in a bubble. It has to reflect and rest on the support of the public to be successful and sustainable. Ignorance is not bliss, it's folly. A former colleague of mine, who was also a longtime diplomatic correspondent before he joined state, wrote a marvelous little book on this diplomacy journalism relationship called Wary Partners. The bottom line is we cannot have successful diplomacy and well-informed foreign policy without excellence in diplomatic journalism. And we're very pleased to continue that tradition this afternoon. I want to also recognize another element of Teddy Weintal's bequest, and that was to the Weintal Scholarship Program that is given every year to an SFS grad student who comes from the field of journalism and is committed to going into global public service. Before I introduce Edward formally, I want to turn the floor over to our dean, Joel Hellman, and congratulate him. This is his 10th anniversary as dean. Woo! Yeah. And I want to thank him very much for joining us today. So Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. I wasn't even aware of that 10th anniversary. No one brought me a cake. But it's wonderful to be here. And first of all, I think what we are seeing at the School of Foreign Service is the extraordinary interest that our students have had over the years and continue to have in careers in journalism, echoing Barbara's comments about what a critical part this has always been of our community and of our student interests. And I think this is exciting to be able to use this event to be able to acknowledge the important role that journalists play in diplomacy more broadly, and of course in our school. I want to just very quickly thank all of those who've been involved in this, the Center for Asian Studies, of course, the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, Georgetown's own program on journalism, which keeps growing and building new heights, and also to congratulate our own Weintal scholars for being here. Barbara already mentioned, and I don't have to tell this audience about the centrality of journalism to everything that we do. At this moment in particular, the role of journalists is under such threat in so many places around the world. It is under threat structurally by the shifts in the communications and ways in which we can impart information in the world. It is under threat from new technologies and how they're reshaping how we get information. So there are sort of these almost tectonic structural constraints and structural changes that are going on that are going to shift the role of journalists. I don't think it's going to in any way change the incredible demand that we have for the work that journalists do and trying to understand the truth, but it is going to change so much the delivery mechanisms, the way in which people engage. But beyond those structural changes, we are also seeing globally with the sort of shifts that we are seeing in the tendencies and trends towards increasing global authoritarianism and autocracy, that always means and always entails an attack on the sources of freedom that constrain autocracy. And that means, of course, what we have seen, which is record numbers of imprisonments, attacks, violence against journalism, which has taken a profession which is always one that has confronted risk and taken that risk to a new level. And we are seeing so many journalists under attack, so many journalists under threat, so many journalists who've sacrificed their lives for the cause of reporting the truth. So this is a remarkable moment in which to celebrate those who undertake this risk and those who continue to their commitment to the truth. And of course, it is a particularly important moment for those who are committed to understanding and using their journalistic skills to help us understand better the practice of diplomacy. And it's a particular pleasure to be giving this award to Ed Wong, who's now currently an incredibly important voice in understanding the shapes and changes of diplomacy in our own country, which, as we are likely to sort of see over the coming months and coming years, in itself will undergo some very sort of significant shifts and challenges, and the need to have those reporting on those changes, those understanding and helping us understand how the practice of diplomacy is being reshaped and how the practice of diplomacy is under threat and at risk because of political changes in this country and around the world has never been more important. So it's in all of those reasons that we are happy to be able to honor the work of journalists and listen and learn from the journalists who are helping us and helping to inform us and helping keep our democracy thriving. And we couldn't be obviously happier to have someone of the quality and range and experience of Ed Wong. He's a practitioner who for 25 years has been reporting with intelligence, with nuance, with courage from some of the toughest places to report. Iraq and China. We'll be hearing of his exciting book on China, but he's also reported from and visited, well over 100 countries. So the breadth and range of his knowledge is just immense, and we're excited to hear from him. We are excited also to hear from his current reports day by day now from the press room of the State Department, because of course we are all eager to see what changes that come from this change of administration and the incredible efforts of diplomacy that this administration has taken and the next administration will need to take. Ed Wong is a dedicated, he's a talented, thoughtful journalist. His reporting has made all of us smarter and lifted, really, I think, the weight of ignorance that we have unfortunately sort of seen in so many other parts of the world through his reporting, and just the kind of globally focused journalist who deserves the prize created to honor the interaction between foreign affairs and journalism. So it's with that, we thank you, Ed, for joining us today. We thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing the remarks from his book and honoring that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, you've been feted, but I still need to sort of explain a little bit more. The dean picked up many parts of your bio, but I do want to do the formal introduction. You are a distinguished career journalist. You've reported for over 25 years, 13 of those as an international correspondent and bureau chief in not just Iraq, but China, which is the Times' largest overseas operation. He's traveled to over 100 countries, reported from dozens as far afield as Afghanistan, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Uganda. His illustrative career, I should note, started right here in the DMV, where he covered Maryland for the Potomac Gazette. Start small, think big. He graduated with honors from the University of Virginia with a degree in English and joined the Times after receiving dual master degrees in journalism and international studies from University of California, Berkeley. Having spent his apprenticeship working in the Metro business and sports sections, he became a correspondent in Iraq for 4 years, beginning in 2003. We've already figured out that we were in Iraq at different times. Following language study, important, at Middlebury College, Beijing Language and Culture University, and Taiwan University, he moved in 2008 to Beijing and worked for a decade there as both foreign correspondent and bureau chief. He brings a very special perspective to his reporting. His recently published memoir, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, chronicles both his and his father's personal narratives in the Republic of China and their very different experiences. Edward was born and raised in the U.S., moved, and was born and raised in the U.S. and moved to Beijing as a journalist well into his career. His father grew up in China, eventually became disenchanted with the new China, escaped to Hong Kong, and then ultimately came to the U.S. In his prologue, Edward writes of being the son of two empires, and his and his father's experiences provide the context for an increasingly difficult bilateral relationship. He has watched the U.S.-China relationship up close since returning to Washington to cover the State Department and has traveled extensively to China, including recently with Secretary Blinken. His work, as said, is thoughtful, insightful, contextual exploration of the arc of that relationship. In a past Weintal, Jeff Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, noted that of all the challenges facing the United States, and I'm quoting here, managing the rise of China without coming into conflict with China while defending our interest across Asia will be the most complicated. How very prescient that was and how increasingly true today. We've asked Edward to talk to us today about his experiences covering foreign policy writ large, his views on how the U.S. policy might change under the incoming administration, with a particular focus on Beijing. He's an excellent guide to help us understand how well Washington has managed the challenges over the last 2 decades, last 2 administrations, and what challenges lie ahead. Please join me in honoring Edward Wong for his distinguished journalism in foreign policy and diplomacy.
So first, I want to congratulate the diplomats and former diplomats in this room. I saw as I was taking a car over here that there will be an incoming leader to the State Department, to the Weintal State Department, and someone who's experienced in foreign policy. So I'm sure we all look forward to interacting with Senator Rubio, Secretary Rubio in the months ahead. So thank you, Ambassador Bodine, for that generous introduction and for inviting me here today to accept the Weintal Prize, which has a distinguished history. When I was told about this prize, my journalistic instinct said to do a bit of research online. So I discovered that a director of the CIA, William Casey, gave a speech at the presentation of this prize in 1983. And I find that a bit ironic that someone charged with keeping secrets was commending journalists who try to ferret out those secrets. I'd also like to thank Dean Joe Hellman of the School of Foreign Service. And I also want to thank my friends associated with Georgetown, including Professor Jim Millward, who has shared his wisdom on China with me for more than a decade, and Craig Simon, right there in the second row, a diplomat and ex-journalist I've known since my early days in China and who's doing a fellowship here this year. There's Dan Spinelli, a graduate student at Georgetown who was an ace fact checker on my book. So I'd like to thank, of course, along with Dan, the many other students here, especially those studying public policy and international affairs, and who are eager to serve our nation in whatever capacity after they graduate. Most importantly, I want to thank my family. My mother and my sister are here in the front row, and my wife and daughter will be joining me at a dinner on campus later. My father, who is 92, is at home today and will watch this online later. You'll hear more about him later. They're all my guiding lights, my North Stars in a world where we need those more than ever. I wrote these remarks in a rush, so I apologize in advance if they sound rough around the edges. My colleagues and I have been dealing with a flood of news since last Tuesday's election. And also, don't tell my employer this, but last night I found myself polishing my resume. I saw that President-elect Donald Trump had appointed a man who is both a book author and media employee to one of the most powerful cabinet positions, Secretary of Defense. So I wanted to get my resume in order in case I get a call from his transition team. But I'm not holding my breath. Of course, I'm humbled to be here talking with all of you. It's an honor for me to be accepting this award from a respected institute at such a prestigious university and in my hometown. I fled the Washington area soon after I reached adulthood. I went first to Charlottesville, then farther and farther afield, Berkeley, New York, Baghdad, Beijing. I returned in 2018 to cover diplomacy and foreign policy, thinking my family and I needed peace and stability after all those adventures. Of course, any journalist moving to Washington in 2018 soon found themselves immersed in the exact opposite environment. And here we are again. I decided to change the title for my talk today to a new one, given the events that we've all seen since last week. This talk I call Empires in Extremis. I want to touch not only on what I witnessed and documented in China, but also in Iraq during the height of the war, as well as here in Washington reporting on the Trump and Biden administrations. It's a moment of profound change in the world. Many Americans feel like the foundations of our democracy have been shaken and that we face a less certain future than at any point in our adult lifetimes. I'll keep this talk short. We'll get to questions about the future at the end. I'm eager to discuss them with Ambassador Bodine and with all of you. First, I want to provide some historical context for how I think about these issues. I want to tell you a family story, and I'm going to show you a family photo album. All of this is part of a much bigger story. That bigger story is about a leader who mobilized the masses and widened divisions within society to gain power. It's about a people who sought national rejuvenation or return to greatness. It's about a nation where a single political party gained complete control of all major aspects of security, information, and technology. That party is the most successful authoritarian body of the last century. This is a story about China from the days of Mao's triumphs and tragedies to today. This narrative gives us a window into the direction the nation is going under Xi Jinping in his efforts to realize his imperial dreams, the same dreams that members of my family alternately embraced and rejected under Mao. And this story gives us a view onto two very different things that are shaping the world order: the nature of the rising tensions between the world's two superpowers and the growing appeal of authoritarian leaders around the globe. I set out to tell this story in my new book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. It was a 6-year project for me, and I used it to sum up many of the ideas that had taken root as a result of my graduate studies and my more than 2 decades reporting overseas and here in Washington. I had different reasons for writing this book. As I was ending my tour in China for the New York Times, I knew I wanted to write a book that probed Chinese history under the Communist Party, and particularly through the lens of the party's drive to reconstitute China as an empire. My father was part of that project when he joined the People's Liberation Army under Mao and took part in the military occupation of Xinjiang, now the vast northwest frontier region of China. And as a reporter for the Times, I witnessed the efforts of current-day Chinese leaders to impose hardline controls on those parts of the empire that the military has seized decades earlier, and also the attempts of those leaders to expand the empire, both through a push for territory in the seas around China and in displacing America as a dominant player in the global system of commerce and multilateral institutions that American presidents helped create from the ashes of World War II. If you're in the halls of power in Beijing and commanding the national power the party has achieved at breathtaking speed over the past 4 decades, it might look perfectly reasonable to try to do this. Another reason I wrote this book was to present the epochal and tragic history of the mid-20th century from the perspective of people who lived it as young adults. That generation is almost gone from this earth. I believe that with their passing goes the memories of people who saw firsthand what autocrats and their mass movements did to this world. The wars, the pogroms, the economic disasters that killed tens of millions and led to the repression of many more. There are many lessons we can draw from the last century. but they only matter if we can preserve and articulate the memories of the people who survived those events. And so let me present you part of the story I told in my book in the form of a family photo album. So I wanted to move. So this is my family. Me as a young boy, my sister 2 years younger than me, my mother, my father. It's taken at Mount Vernon, Alexandria, so it's a very American photo. When I was growing up in Alexandria, I was born here in Washington, grew up in Alexandria. This was how I saw my father most days. He put on this red uniform, black pants to go to work at Sampan Cafe, a restaurant on Franconia Road. And he's one of the many, people who might have waited on you at a Chinese restaurant. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s when I was studying Chinese history and politics at Berkeley and wanted to probe deeper into my family history, asked them about their time in China, that my father handed me this photo, the only other photo I've seen of him in uniform, which is a photo of him in a People's Liberation Army uniform taken in 1953 in China. And so I started delving into his past and my mother's past and their relationship with China back in my 20s, interviewing them about the country. And then towards the end of my time in China for the New York Times, I decided I would write a book about the country, about its national history, and I would do it through the lens of my family. So after I returned here in Washington, while I was doing my day job for the New York Times, I was interviewing my parents, my father especially, and my uncle Sam, 4 years as senior, about what they experienced in China and what they went through. This is my father and his brother, Sam, in Hong Kong. They were born to a merchant family in Hong Kong. Their father sold herbal medicine, importing it from China, selling it in a shop in Hong Kong in the British colony, and then also exporting it to Chinese merchants throughout Southeast Asia. So they were part of this transnational class of Cantonese who could move easily between southern China, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia. My father lived through the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong when they seized it right after they attacked Pearl Harbor in Japan. He and his family decided that he and his brother should move to Guangdong province in southern China because the family thought they would be safer there. At that time, in the mid-1940s, the nationalists and the Japanese were fighting for control of southern China, but neither had complete control at any given time. So the power was fluid there. My father grew up in Taishan County in Guangdong, went to high school in Guangzhou. He went to a prestigious boarding school there. The Japanese were eventually defeated, of course, by the Americans. They surrendered. And then when that happened, the Chinese Civil War, which had been dormant during the Japanese War, reignited with the communists led by Mao fighting the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. And my father started to hear about the communist ideology down there in the South. He heard about Mao's vision for a new China, about why Mao wanted to rejuvenate China, about his goals of restoring China's wealth and power, bringing it on par with the United States and Great Britain, and getting rid of the corrupt nationalist government. So when my father graduated in 1950, he was graduating into a China that was ruled by the newly empowered communists. They had just defeated the nationalists in the Civil War months earlier. Mao had declared the founding of the People's Republic on October 1st, 1949. And my father, like many of his classmates, felt that they needed to go north to serve this new China in whatever capacity they could. His brother, who was 4 years older, took the opposite tack. His brother accepted a scholarship from the US government to come here to America to study engineering, and he ended up studying engineering in George Washington University here in DC. My father instead enrolled in Beijing Agricultural University in Beijing, took the long train ride up there from Guangzhou in the south. And on the first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, he marches with other students, with soldiers, with factory workers in front of Mao in Tiananmen Square. And Mao and the other leaders waved to them. Within weeks, my father decides to drop out of university and enroll in the People's Liberation Army. Mao at that time is exhorting young Chinese to come out and fight for the defense of China in Korea. On the Korean Peninsula, the American-led forces are fighting the North Koreans and Chinese troops there. And Mao is telling people that if the Americans defeat the Chinese and the North Koreans there, then they'll march onward to Beijing and topple the communists. So my father signs up for the army, and he's sent to the far northeast of China, up there near the Soviet Union and North Korea. He enrolls in an Air Force Academy. But within weeks of his training in Harbin, he is told that he will not be serving in the Air Force in Korea, and that instead he'll be put into an army unit that will be sent to the far northwest region of China. And he's uncertain about why this is happening, but he has a sense that something has gone awry with the path that he has chosen. Nevertheless, he decides to embrace the mission. It's part of building the new China, and he joins that army unit, is sent in a series of trucks out to Xinjiang, the far northwest frontier, which was a region in Central Asia that the last dynasty of China, the Qing, had conquered. The ethnic Manchus who ruled the Qing, they had conquered this area with their armies, and it had fallen away entirely from the control of the nationalists and the communists during the Chinese Civil War and the warlord era. And now the communists were intent on retaking this area and bringing it back into the fold of the empire. So my father was part of the first military occupation of Xinjiang under the communists. Here he is in the other photo that survives of him wearing a PLA uniform, also taken in 1953, a photo of him in a summer uniform. And he was sent to a series of different posts in Xinjiang, where his mission was mainly at first to indoctrinate various Kazakh Muslim soldiers and herders into the communist ideology, and then to exert various forms of control with his fellow soldiers on the area. This is where his first posting was, in Altai, near the border with Russia, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan today. I went up there in 2014. This photo is from a trip that I took up there to try and find out. I wanted to find out what his army unit had done there. And I encountered, the type of landscape, the type of people that he must have lived among, very different than interior China. And it's an area that over the decades, the communists have tried different forms of on which the communists have exerted different forms of control. When my father was out there, in the first years, the head of the political office in the entire Northwest region was Xi Jinping, who is the father of Xi Jinping, the current leader of China. And so the elder Xi and Mao would have these discussions about how to control this area of Xinjiang. And my father found himself working under the directive of the elder Xi. Just as decades later, I would find myself in China for the New York Times, reporting on the rise to power of his son, Xi Jinping. And my father's final posting was here in a place called Weintal, near what was then Soviet Kazakhstan. My father's put into one of the first military agricultural garrisons that was constructed by the PLA and by the central government to produce food, produce crops and livestock for the troops that were occupying the area. The system, called in Chinese the Bingtuan, has since grown into a vast form of control spread throughout the entire region. And even today, many of the products it produces are exported abroad to grocery stores in America and Europe. Eventually, in 1957, my father though he felt he had been sent to exile in Xinjiang, eventually hears a call from the center for talented youth to re-enroll in university in order to help build up a new industrialized China under Mao. So he takes a test and gets the opportunity to leave Xinjiang, leave the army, and go to Xi'an, the former imperial capital, to enroll in an engineering program. And there he decides to study aeronautics engineering in order to build military aircraft for the PLA as a civilian. He is eager to help serve the new China. He writes a letter soon after arriving back in Xi'an to his older brother, Sam, who's here in Washington, beseeching Sam to also come back and use his engineering skills learned here in the US to help build up this new China. But instead, several things happen in the late 1950s that shakes my father's faith in Mao and in the Communist Party. The first is that officials have been reviewing a pending application that military officers in Xinjiang have filed on behalf of my father for party membership. He had Wonder Trust out in Xinjiang, and he wanted to join the party. They had sponsored him for party membership. And officials in Xi'an told him, well, we've looked into your family background. There's still many questions about it. Remember, he was born in a British colony to a merchant family. His brother was here in America. And these officials said, we need to investigate your family and you further. And he realized then that his path into the party was barred probably permanently. Mao at that time also purged senior leaders in the party, including military leaders that my father had looked up to because they were starting to question Mao's economic policies. And then those economic policies, which Mao called the Great Leap Forward, led to complete disaster for China. From around 1958, for several years onward, China fell into a great famine where around 30 to 40 million Chinese perished, one of the great man-made disasters of the 20th century. Here's my father having survived the famine, emaciated. He fell sick in Xi'an, as did his classmates, but they all survived. And then my father decides that he has to escape from China, that there's no future there for him, and the future of the entire country is questionable. So he goes south to Guangzhou, and through family connections, gets a travel permit, this document you see up here, to go to Macau. He pretends he's just going there for a visit. Macau is a Portuguese colony at the time. He slips across the border, finds shelter in a hotel room there, and then months later gets permission, final permission from Hong Kong authorities who are in Macau to go back to his birth city, the British colony. So he ends up back in Hong Kong, trains as an engineer, but then eventually in 1967 decides that his future is in America and takes his grandmother to move here to Washington and reunite with his brother Sam. Here he is in with the entire family and celebrating the grandmother's 90th birthday in Jade Palace here in Chinatown, Washington, D.C. And my father works here in his first restaurant job. We grow up in Alexandria, and my father and my mother during that time don't make visits back to China or Hong Kong. It's not until after my father retires from his job at Sampan Cafe that he takes a tour with my mother and my sister to China in 1999. And then he visits twice more. He visits after I become a New York Times correspondent in China, coming there in both 2009 when I get married, and in 2012 when my daughter Aria is born. And in 2012, I make a trip with him outside of Beijing to Guangzhou in order for him to see some of those classmates that he graduated with in 1950. And we're making that trip at the same time that Xi Jinping is making his first trip as leader of China outside of Beijing. Xi is also going down there to Guangdong province. And so it's tracking Xi's itinerary and movements as I was traveling in the South, in the birth province of my father, or the home province of my father. And the trip was significant politically for several reasons for Xi. One, he appeared on a destroyer, a naval destroyer in the South China Sea. And I think it was to send a message that these were the expansionary ambitions of China under him, that he was intent on expanding China's control over the seas around it. That would include Taiwan at some point. And he would take, control of the military and use that to his advantage. And then he also gave a speech during that trip in Guangdong province, a secret speech to the party, to party officials there, which was leaked later. And in the speech, he talks about the downfall of the Soviet Union. And he says, this is one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, this great empire breaking apart. And he says, I'm determined not to let that happen here in China. As long as the Communist Party remembers history and remembers their mission, then China won't break apart. The party won't lose power. In the Soviet Union, he says, there was no one man enough to step up and maintain control of the party and of the country. And so I think in those different elements, we see aspects of Xi's imperial dreams. So all that is central to the party's project since Mao. For the Communist Party, holding on to the territory of the reconstituted empire and perhaps expanding it is as important, in my view, as building legitimacy through economic growth. But there's another empire in Asia, as we know, when that began life on the shores of the Atlantic, but then expanded into the Pacific when it took over a colony of Spain, the Philippines, at the close of the 19th century. And in World War II, American troops fought through the island chains in that vast ocean before dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japanese civilians to force Emperor Hirohito to surrender. China, Hong Kong, and other parts of Asia were liberated from the Japanese occupation, the one that my father and my uncle remember so well, even today in their 90s. And now there's growing talk of another war in the Pacific, this time between America and China. Some say war between 2 empires that are in contact along a fault line is inevitable. But I believe that neither the American nor the Chinese governments want that. And the question before us today is how to avoid it. How to avoid it when China's national power has grown over the decades through global commerce, including with the United States, and when it is moving to challenge America for military primacy in Asia. How do these 2 entwined empires resolve that? And how do they avoid war? It's hard to know the precise perspective of leaders in Beijing. The top tiers of the Communist Party are a black box. Don't trust anyone who tells you they know what Xi Jinping is thinking. But it's more important than ever for the US government to try to glean the intentions of the leader of China. What does Xi plan to do around Taiwan, around the South China Sea? What are his aims and what are his limits? We don't want to stumble into a war that would be devastating for the entire world. We saw what happened to America in Vietnam. My wife, Tani, as a child, was on one of the last American helicopters from the embassy in Saigon in April 1975. So I know that tragic history well. And of course, there's a more recent example, one that has helped lead America to the exact moment we're in now. I began my career reporting on international news and foreign policy by going to Iraq in 2003. When I left in 2007, I concluded that the war was not only misguided, but a moral failure, a humanitarian catastrophe. It's clear that most Americans share that view now. It was started by a nation whose officials all claim, generation after generation, that they were defending the so-called rules-based international order. They talk of American exceptionalism. The American imperial project in Iraq resulted in the deaths of 200,000 to 300,000 Iraqi civilians and thousands of American service members. Most of the political class here in Washington avoided talking honestly about what America had done. In the run-up to the war, politicians and policymakers from both parties had agreed to give a president the power to send young Americans to invade and occupy a sovereign nation on false pretenses and to die there. Journalists were part of this march to war as well. Many of the same politicians who gave that approval for the war would never contemplate sending their own children into battle. Call it what you want, groupthink, consensus opinion, but their embrace of an orthodoxy and the horrific consequences of that generated popular resentment against the so-called elites in Washington. It's a resentment that still burns today. 9 years ago, a businessman and television celebrity from Queens saw an opening to talk bluntly about the disasters of the post-9/11 wars, to express in stark terms what everyone outside of Washington was thinking, and to use that as one of the instruments that would allow him to seize power. Like the populist leaders of the 20th century, Donald J. Trump, with his uncanny political instincts, sensed what the masses felt on the so-called forever wars and many other issues, and he seized the moment. He saw the weaknesses in the system, the self-inflicted wounds. Those instincts have served him well through 2 elections. Now, where does he take the creaking American empire, the superpower at odds with itself? He has talked about imposing double-digit tariffs on many countries, allies as well as rivals. He has talked about his admiration for autocrats, and especially Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. He wants to be at the table with them. He has talked about ending the wars in Europe and the Middle East without explaining exactly how he'll do that. Meanwhile, he has said America's allies need to spend more on defense or pay for American support, rejecting the idea that those alliances are one of the greatest forms of American power projection and security around the world. None of us know where America will end up in 4 years. But Trump has now ascended twice to the top of our republic, or our empire, because of its hubris, its contradictions, and its tragic flaws. These can overshadow the great ideals at the heart of our nation. In my book, I made a couple observations about parallels between America and China. One is this: there's a clarity to the nature of each imperium in the way it exercises power far from the center. I saw this with America in Iraq, and I saw this with China. And here's the second observation. Many Chinese citizens are naturally proud of the restoration of their nation, pride that is magnified by the party's nurturing of the fires of patriotism and nationalism. The state has told them in classrooms and films and news articles of a centuries of China's victimhood at the hands of Western powers. But there's something too that undergirds their attitude, a profound belief in their own innocence. It is the same innocence that theologian Reinhold Niebuhr says infuses the national character of America. While evil can be done to these societies, they can do no evil. The sense of innocence is what allows an empire to choose to walk paths of darkness in the name of doing good, with the unwavering support of its citizens. I believe America is on that path now. It has been on that path for some time. It is inside a labyrinth of its own making. China and outside powers did not do this to America, though America will have to contend with those powers while it's in this state. And so I want to leave you with this final question. While we, the citizens, are in this labyrinth, what is the role that each of us will play? Thank you for your time today and for giving me the chance to speak to all of you.
I don't know if I'm on or not.
I'm on. I think I'm on.
You're on.
I
Am I on?
You sound
Okay.
great.
All right. I sound on. All right. Thank you very much for that. That was both a fascinating look into your personal history, and I think the parallels that you draw between China and the U.S. Are profound. I want to take that. You start, you end with a question as to, okay, what do we do now? And I was sort of expecting, I wanted an answer.
I'm a reporter, so I ask questions.
You ask
Right.
questions, okay. Well, flip yourself around and just as a informed citizen.
Mhm.
What do you see as our constructive options going forward? You've painted the picture of where the path that we may be on. How do we change that path?
Well, I think that obviously we need at home, we need to reinforce some of the foundational features of our democracy. As a journalist, probably the thing that concerns me more than anything else is our fractured information environment. I do think that, a large part of the divisions that we see in our society, the polarization is due to the fact that there's no longer a shared consensus or majority opinion around information. People go to different places. I think even, in the wake of the last election, I was talking with various people, students on some campuses, probably many of you share this view that, among their friends, a lot of the information they were getting was through chat groups that they have with each other, where all kinds of information picked from different parts of the online world is put in there without any sense of what the veracity of the information is. And I think that that's happening all across America. So there has to be some push by informed citizens to reestablish, I think, the norms of shared information, shared knowledge in this country. And that's, in the news media environment, it's in education as well. And I think part of the onus is also on education, not necessarily at the university level, but at lower levels, elementary school on up, to talk about civic duties, to talk about the media and how to get reliable information, and to talk about what democracy means and what we as Americans need to do to defend democracy, not necessarily even abroad, but here within our own countries. I think too often we talk about the threats to America from overseas without sufficiently looking inward.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I agree. It sounds like a very straightforward set of solutions. I'm not quite
Not
sure.
straightforward at all.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how we get to even an agreed civic education.
Yeah.
But you to take that a little bit further, how do you journalism, U.S. government, most institutions are at least seen skeptically by too many of our fellow citizens. How does journalism rebuild trust and credibility when you're in this new social media, ecosystem?
Right. That's a great question. And I've been thinking, obviously, grappling with this very question, in the wake of the elections last week. And I have to say that I think, national news organizations, ones like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, all of these, were all speaking in a certain sense to, an insular audience. It's a large audience, it's millions of people, but it is one very discrete audience. And I actually think that the key to journalists and journalism winning back the trust of many American citizens is to try and reestablish, try and grow back local journalism. I think that, my first, as you were saying, my first newspaper job was here in Maryland, in Potomac, Maryland, working for a newspaper called the Potomac Gazette. And I think that when you're working at that level among people, you establish these very personal ties with people. I would go to, board meeting, like civic board meetings, school board meetings. You would meet all of these people in the community. They would, in a sense, trust you or trust information you were presenting because you were one of them. And so I think that, someone in a corner of the US reading the New York Times is trying to parse out who this person is who's giving them that information, what this company is, how can they trust information they're being given. Whereas on a local level, the people who are giving you this information, you see them at the grocery store, you interact with them in PTA meetings. I think it's my firm belief now that that's really what we have to do to try and rebuild this trust.
There's a problem with the business model of that.
Yeah.
I live in Alexandria. I didn't realize we had that in common.
Right.
And we have some very nice little, local newspapers. But the business model for print journalism and major media simply doesn't seem to be there. I know there's been some talk about turning them into nonprofits.
Yeah.
Just basically changing the business model. It's not profitable. It's a civic duty. Do you think that's viable?
I don't know. I know people who are working in that space. I have a good friend, for example, who's running a project called the American Journalism Project, which is a foundation that tries to help out various local news organizations with grants. I think it's an effort. It's an experiment right now, and you know, AJP is not the only one. There are other efforts at that. So I think we want to see how that fares going forward. It is, you know, there have been times in American history when, you know, wealthy business people have stepped up to try and support journalism. Obviously, we see that happening even on with national organizations like Jeff Bezos right now. But of course, it's all in his view. It's like it's a market. There's a market directive. He's hoping it'll be profitable. The question is whether there will be people who will step up in a philanthropic way, and also at the same time allow these organizations are helping to remain independent, like very independent from any editorial control. So I think that this is something that we have to explore and experiment with going forward.
Wow. Another major challenge to sorry, I'm a Middle Easterner and I have a cold, so journalism is something that the dean mentioned, which is the physical threat to journalists operating in any number of countries around the world. It's become a very high risk profession. And how is this affecting the work of foreign correspondents, international journalists, such as yourself, your ability, your willingness to go out there in an environment which you're no longer one of the protected classes?
Yeah, and I think we obviously saw that happen with Evan Gershkovich, a brave reporter for the Wall Street Journal, who was held captive by Putin's government for a long spell. I think that, you know, the risk landscape out there is very different. Journalists have always covered wars. I mean, I covered a war, and I think that that type of danger will always be there for journalists. But it's the other type of danger, which I think is one that we're grappling with now, is authoritarian governments deciding to use journalists as bargaining chips in whatever plans they have. And I think that was clear. That was clearly part of Putin's plan with Evan. I think it makes us, you know, recalibrate our assessment of the risks in those countries. Before, we were seen as more of a neutral participant in information gathering. And I think, you know, we all have to make these changes, I think, in how we tackle issues on the ground. So one example is when Hong Kong, which is under the Communist Party in Beijing, there was semi-autonomous at one point, decided to pass their national security law in 2019. Several major news organizations, including the New York Times, decided they had to move their editing offices, which were based in Hong Kong, to Korea, for example. And so I think that they sensed that this new law was so amorphous in the way it was written, that it would allow the police to seize any journalist that even had any of their work could be construed in even the vaguest sense as violating national security, going against the directives of the government. Then they could be seized and detained. So far in Hong Kong, that has not happened yet to foreign journalists. But I think that, you know, these news organizations took that preventive measure to at least move the editing staff while leaving a couple of journalists on the ground there. So I think that we're all recalibrating how we approach these different territories now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just, you know, having been a diplomat and watched how security issues have slowly confined diplomats who used to be out and about and doing things not unlike what journalists do, and seeing how that's affected our ability to do our job. I'm very concerned that it might end up affecting you and your colleagues' ability to do that job, that other access, that greater freedom of movement that we increasingly don't have.
Yeah. I don't want to overstate the risks either. I do think that there's still a lot of room for journalists to be out there in the field, and I encourage it for anyone who wants to go to some of these countries if they make the proper risk assessment. So, for example, in the People's Republic of China, I have two American colleagues who are there who can travel around the country, interview people. Sometimes they run into police harassment, police officers in, a town might start following them. But for the most part, they can buy a plane ticket from in Beijing, fly somewhere, land somewhere, do interviews. My entire time in China, I found that that was possible. The only area that was sealed off, unless you got official permission, was Tibet, central Tibet. But otherwise, for the most part, you could travel around, do interviews. It's not, I don't think it's the intense police state in most parts of China that Americans might think it is. It's not this, it hasn't reached the level of Big Brother Orwellian surveillance yet, although I do think that their technologies are improving dramatically on that front. So I think that there are still many places in the world, including, as I said, in the most successful authoritarian country in the world, China, to do journalism.
Let me ask a question, since this is a university and a school of foreign service. You spent a great deal of time learning Mandarin Chinese. How important was it to have those language skills to do your job? And could you see a difference between operating in Iraq without Arabic, operating in China with Chinese?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ambassador. I know that you're fluent in Arabic, and that must have served you well in the Middle East. I thought it was a night and day difference. In Iraq, I worked with Iraqi reporters who would help do interpretation when I was interviewing people. I often felt that I was getting, summaries of what the people were saying, but missing the textures and the nuances of the conversation. In China, because I knew I'd started studying Mandarin as a young adult, then I could pick up on a lot of the conversations around me. I could catch the nuances better. Also, because you're operating in this environment where you don't want to get on the radar of police officers, then if I was traveling around on my own, I could slip into places or enter places. I look like someone who belongs in the country, and speaking Mandarin or Cantonese in the South, then I could move around, talk to people. And I think that that was very invaluable, especially in the context of these authoritarian states that we're talking about. So I think that, obviously in this room, there are probably people who have studied languages, spent years studying it. I would encourage, if you're ever given the opportunity, to continue studying languages, and especially when going to new places. I think the State Department has great programs for language study.
We try. We try. Some of us are better at learning languages, but I will give the State Department credit for trying. I'm going to ask you a big foreign policy question, and a very simple one. How do you think the world is reacting to our election?
Yeah, I think so. My sense from my conversations leading up to our election was a lot of the world expected this. I would talk with, you probably had similar conversations, diplomats from the Middle East, diplomats from Asia, from Europe. They kind of expected this outcome. And I think that they had already started preparing their minds for it. They know what, President Trump's approach to foreign policy in his first administration. And, I summarized some of it in my talk, and it's very clear. He's a very transparent leader. And so I think that they're going to take different approaches. I think that some of them will try and work very quickly to curry favor with him. They know that his views and his diplomacy is highly personalized. So they'll work quickly. Those will include both leaders from our allies as well as leaders from American rivals. I think we'll see someone like Kim Jong-un, for example, maybe start moving quickly to reestablish
more love letters.
Yeah, maybe more love letters, which of course Trump loved. He took some to Mar-a-Lago.
I know.
Yeah,
did a book on them.
And so I think we'll see. I think that's a blueprint that leaders might adopt. They saw what happened. In fact, I covered the first Trump administration. I actually thought that one-on-one diplomacy between Trump and Kim was the most interesting storyline that I covered in that first administration. And I was during Hanoi when they had their second summit. So I think we're going to see more of that. I think we'll see that Trump wants to do that with Putin. He wants to do that with Xi Jinping. He wants to do it with Kim. He wants to do it with MBS, with various other leaders. And I think they know that too.
Oh, yeah.
I also think that they've, countries around the world have listened carefully to his complaints that countries aren't buying enough things from America, or investing enough in America,
Yeah.
or somehow giving America enough in compensation for whatever America's doing with them in the world. So I think that we'll see them moving quickly to, for example, some countries might decide to ramp up arms purchases from American defense companies, or they'll move or establish factories here for some, they'll encourage some of their companies to establish factories here. I think that the tariffs will be a huge part of Trump's foreign policy, that he'll impose tariffs on multiple countries, and that he will then want his envoys or himself to negotiate with those countries.
Pull them off.
Yeah, to pull them off, exactly. And it might be trade deals. I think trade, in his mind, that's the main thing he's obsessed with. But there could be other elements that he brings into that mix. They could be negotiating for, military partnerships and other types of agreements like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about the tariffs as something you put on and then you negotiate, slowly pulling them off.
Yeah. That's my sense of where he's going with that.
No, that's and people finding ways to make nice with him. I heard shortly after the election, the Secretary General of NATO praising Trump for having pushed NATO to get up to their 2%.
Right.
And it was a love letter on thank you so much for having us step up.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see a great deal of
And
that.
I want to add one more thing, which I thought was very clear in the first Trump administration, was that Trump himself has his own ideas about how to approach these countries. And again, a lot of it is very oriented around trade. But then the officials that he picks to staff, the top ranks of his foreign policy agencies or national security agencies might have their own ideas also. And I remember in the first Trump administration, I would talk to foreign diplomats, business leaders, others who were trying to find the right official in the administration to talk to either get their point across to Trump or to work on the side on something apart from the White House. And I think that that'll be a big question in this administration. In the Biden administration, what I saw was a highly disciplined administration that spoke with the same voice across agencies. I don't know if that'll be the case in Trump 2.0. I think I already see certain contradictions in some of the people he's chosen for some of these positions. Like, for example, some of them are very hawkish on China, want to decouple from China, not just to impose tariffs on China and then negotiate for things, but to actually decouple the economies. Whereas, someone like Elon Musk, apparently Trump's closest civilian advisor at this point, has vested interests, business interests in China. So I think we're going to see some areas coming to conflict.
Doing a quick skim on the bios of the people who have been announced so far, you can see differences on Ukraine, you can see differences on China. If this is putting you in an awkward position, you can just give me a no comment. But what's your assessment of how Rubio is going to fit into this new mix?
Well, I think that for most of us who have spent some time in Washington and worked on foreign policy, Senator Rubio is a fairly known quantity. He's been around, since the 2010s, throughout the 2010s. Worked on foreign policy, has very strong views, very, strong views on being aggressive on countries with the communist background. So obviously, he comes from a Cuban exile family. I think that informs his worldview. So he wants to take very aggressive approaches on China, on Russia, on North Korea, on Venezuela, on Cuba. And I think he is not much of a person who will go for a transactional approach with those countries. So I think that at least that's his instinct tells him that. So I think what we'll see is how he calibrates that instinct towards the more transactional approach that I think President-elect Trump would rather take.
Yes.
And so I think we'll see how that works out. I do think that, Senator Rubio has been at the forefront of some trends in American foreign policy and domestic policy that later became mainstream. So when he was senator, for example, he promoted the idea of America embracing industrial policy in order to better compete with China. And he said that the US government has to take a more interventionist hand in our economy in order to compete against a government, the Chinese government, that is very that has a very state-directed economy. And so I think that viewpoint actually has become very mainstream now across both parties, both in the Biden administration, and I think we'll see it very much enforced in the Trump 2.0 administration. Though I do have to say there are people within Trump 2.0, including people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who are very much libertarians and would rather the government play a much smaller role in oversight of business. So I think, again, this is one of those areas where we'll have to see how the tensions play out.
Wow, well, maybe it's the team of rivals 2.0.
Right.
I would love to sit and just chat with you, but I want to open it up to questions from students and some of our other guests here. So particularly, I know there's some journalism students and there's some Asian studies students, so would love to hear some questions from you all. I know everyone is sort of freezing to death, and I apologize for that. And we were told that it was going to warm up, and I don't know quite. We'll get to that another time. But any questions? Yes, Chris. And microphone is en route. And please identify yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Chris Klein. I'm a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and also Foreign Service Officer. Been in the State Department for almost 27 years and have served in China. First of all, thank you very, very much for writing your book. I'm learning so much, and that's the great thing about being interested in China. You can just constantly learn. One of the things that you've driven home yet again to me is how very diverse China actually is. Going from Xinjiang to the regional differences between southeastern China and northeastern China. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what divisions you see currently in Chinese society and what implications those have for governance, for what might keep Xi Jinping awake at night, and so forth. Could you talk about your current assessment of Chinese society? I really have been, very interested in the illustrations of the early 50s and that sort of thing. Where do you think things are right now? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very large question. So I'll try and just give a few, brief thoughts that will answer it only partially. So one, of course, I think as I laid out in my talk and is evident in the title of my book, I see China or the party as having reconstituted much of the Qing Empire. And so there are vast regions of China, you know this well, Chris, Xinjiang, Tibet, those areas that make up around a quarter to a third of China's current landmass that feel very, very different than interior China. And in fact, in some ways, don't feel naturally part of a Chinese political entity in our age of modern nation states. Of course, a lot of countries figure out ways to assimilate or incorporate areas of vast ethnic and religious difference, linguistic difference into their countries. I think China is struggling with that. I think the party has struggled with that from the very first day. My father's story illustrates that, of course, like what the military project in Xinjiang was. In my book, I write about those same tensions arising in Tibet, and even in parts that are not in the West. For example, in Guangdong province, where my family is originally from, when I was living in China, I saw protests in Guangzhou that were, against the imposition of Mandarin language in popular media in Guangzhou. And I think that these regional differences, linguistic differences, are very much at play in China across different parts of China. And I think they're very much on the mind of Xi Jinping and of party leaders. Those are probably the easiest ones, I think, to point to. But I do think there are many other trends going on in China within the society that are creating new fault lines. One is gender. I do think that, parts of China or China's exists as a highly patriarchal society. We see a lot of women trying to speak up more, to assert themselves in the roles that they choose to play. And I think the gender disparity in terms of population in China is something that the country will have to grapple with, in which there are many more men than women in certain age groups. And of course, there's the aging of China, the change in demographics of China. I think this raises a big question mark around the continued economic boom of China, because we see there coming a huge aging population in China. And because of the one-child policy, not that many younger people who can take care of them in a society of that size. And I think the government will have to grapple with that, and we'll see big effects on the economy, perhaps.
Great. Yeah, the demographic, there's a similar gender demographic imbalance in India.
Right.
And I can't remember the number, but the number of surplus men in China plus the number of surplus men in India are staggering numbers.
Yeah.
And that can't work. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am, please.
Hi, my name's Ronnie. I'm a junior undergraduate student here at Georgetown studying international politics and minor in journalism, as well as an undergraduate certificate in the diplomatic studies program. And yeah, it's a lot of credits, so we'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, so as someone who's interested in both potentially influencing foreign policy one day, but also feeling like I have to choose between journalism, which is a field I'm really passionate about and would love to do. I write for the Hoya, the paper here. Trying to think how to phrase this, but maybe I'll just put it bluntly. But I'm wondering if you've ever felt frustrated with your role as a journalist, as someone, as I think you alluded to, who may be more knowledgeable, have more relevant experience, and have made very keen observations through your experience, rather compared to those making the decisions. And if you ever have those frustrations come up, and two, how you reckon with them. Thank you.
I think she wants you to make a career choice for her.
Right. Or are you asking if I'm going to make a career choice, change myself? I mean, it's an interesting question. I feel like oftentimes I don't feel frustration in the manner that you're pointing out. When I'm observing policy at play, I feel, fairly dispassionate about it, especially I think in foreign policy is an area where it's easy to do that, because you see policy being made on other parts of the world. Oftentimes, a lot of the policymakers are very steeped in the knowledge of the places. The ambassador here is a great example. I think that if anything, reporting on diplomats and diplomacy, I actually see the depth of knowledge that they often bring to tackling these issues. We mentioned language training earlier, and State Department diplomats, for example, get a lot more language training than journalists do when they're going abroad on assignment. So in that way, they have better training systems in place. I do think that journalists have an advantage over many foreign service officers, for instance, which is we move very easily between different levels of the policymaking apparatus. So, for example, I've probably have had more access in terms of conversations with the Secretary of State or with assistant secretaries or with counselors than many of the diplomats who are working in the State Department. So we're seeing how some of the thinking in policymaking at these very high levels, and at the same time, we can go out into the field, interview diplomats on the ground or people who are affected by the decisions on the ground and see what's going on at those levels too. So I feel that journalists are more mobile within these structures. And so I think it gives us, in some ways, more of a panoramic view on policymaking than some of the people who are working within the policy apparatus. I mean, I think once you're at a high level, like the ambassador or others, you do see a lot of that bigger picture, but many of the lower level and mid-level people won't see that. So I think in that sense, journalism is valuable, and I love playing that role as a journalist. I love the fact that I can call up or go up to anyone and try and ask some questions. It could be the leader of a nation, or it could be just a citizen, ordinary citizen in a town in the far-flung reaches of that country, and oftentimes they'll want to engage with me in that. So I personally think journalism is still a very worthwhile career to pursue, and it gives you a unique perspective on this policymaking.
Right, thank you. I know it's getting late, and I also know that everyone is beginning to huddle like a so what I would like to do is thank you I mean, I talked about how much we learned from our journalist colleagues, and I have certainly learned an enormous amount today. And I appreciate your time. I appreciate your work, and would like to thank you with the actual award
Oh, thank you.
for the Weintal Award
Right.
for excellence
Thank you very much,
in
Ambassador.
distinguished reporting. So
Right.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you and to Georgetown for this.
Yeah. And thank you all for coming. And I look forward to, we're going to have dinner.
Right.
But for those of you who don't follow mainstream media, I would suggest New York Times, Edward Wong, his colleagues. You'll learn something.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes.